This is the textbook notes for Chapter 15 on freshwater systems and resources. The chapter starts with a case study about conserving water in California. California is undergoing a major drought in the last couple of years, and they're actually running out of fresh water, so it is a problem. So make sure that you know the causes of California's water problem. The big two are that they've had record lows in the amount of precipitation they've had in the last couple of years, as well as record high temperatures. So the combination of the two is causing major droughts. And because of this, it's having a great negative effect on the agriculture sector of California, which is one of their top industries. It's also affecting the wine industry. Just to keep that in mind, if you look here, it talks about how 80% of California's water supplies is actually used by the agriculture sector. So if there is no water, you can see that there's a big problem going on with the agriculture sector. So we'll be talking a lot about California in this chapter just because they're undergoing major issues. Okay, as you can see here, here's a figure and caption just talking about the different examples of how this crazy drought is affecting different aspects of life in California. All right, so freshwater systems. Make sure you know all the stats and numbers going on here. As you can see, only 1% of all water on the planet is actually available for drinking. Okay, so even though 70% of the earth is covered with water, only 2.5% of that is actually fresh water, but almost 80% of that fresh water is actually frozen in our ice caps or glaciers. 20% is in groundwater, and then 1% is actually your fresh surface water, and so forth and so on. So just make sure that you know that information and those statistics. All right, make sure you know all the bold words on this page and the next. So what surface water is, groundwater, aquifers, what a recharge zone is, a confined and an unconfined aquifer. Make sure you know the difference between those two. And this figure over here talks about that. So just make sure you know all the bold words. Okay, so let's look at this caption here. This is just showing you how water travels from one place to another, and from one freshwater system to another freshwater system to eventually a marine water system. So just make sure that you can see how, for example, pesticides and fertilizers enter the groundwater and surface water on a farm. Then it gets eventually into our rivers, and then eventually into our oceans. Same idea with our urban areas, right? Our urban areas, pollutants, they also go into the groundwater as well as run off into the ocean. So just make sure that you know that everything eventually ends up in our oceans. Okay, so let's go back to this figure here about your confined and unconfined aquifer. All right, these are wells. Okay, you have your artesian well and just a regular well. So make sure that you understand the difference between those two. As you can see here, your regular well goes into your unconfined aquifer, whereas your artesian well actually goes all the way into your confined aquifer. Okay. And a confined is known as a artesian, hence the name artesian well. All right, our artesians, they have a lot more pressure just because they have extra layers on top of them. So it's harder to get water, hence why it's deeper, whereas your unconfined aquifer has no impermeable, which means non-penetrated upper layer to confine it. So the water is under less pressure and can be relatively recharged by surface water. So that means every time it rains, the water can seep into the ground and replenish that location. Okay, now, funny word, you've done a case study on this or will be doing a case study on this. Your Ogallala aquifer, make sure you know about it. It's the largest aquifer in the world. Okay, and we have it here in the United States. As you can see, multiple states share it. So just make sure that you know where it is and its importance. Okay. Other vocab words that you need to make sure that you know what runoff is, what a tributary is, a river system, what a watershed, floodplain, and riparian. So just vocab, because you could always get a multiple choice question that asks something about these. So make sure you know what those are. And there's some pictures of examples. Okay. All right. Next one is eutrophic lakes. We talked a little bit about this. So eutrophic lakes have more nutrients, and the more nutrients you have, the more plants that will grow. Again, this is freshwater, so plants can grow in freshwater bodies, so usually like your lakes. The lakes on campus actually happens to this, where it almost looks like the plants are growing out of the body of water. And the problem is all these extra plants, they choke the lake and fill it up. So basically they use up all the oxygen, and then the aquatic life that live there can't breathe. Now, the opposite type is your eutrophic lake, okay? These have a low amount of nutrients, so they don't have any extra nitrates or phosphates, and it almost looks like too perfect. It's very clear looking. It's got a high amount of oxygen, but there's very little life that lives in it. So it's almost like an oasis where it looks perfect, but it's actually not. So make sure you just know the differences between them. And also just remember that eutrophic lakes usually, they can happen naturally, but they are kind of encouraged or enhanced by human-caused problems. All right, if you look at this photo, just make sure that you know the layers. So your littoral zone, your limnex zone, your profundo zone, and your benthic zone. Just make sure that you know roughly what goes on in those. And the description tells you. Okay. Next page, some more vocabulary. This is all talking about wetlands. All right, New Jersey has a lot of wetlands. The Meadowlands, as we've all know it, is actually a wetland that we have filled in partially. So make sure you know what a wetland is, and then its variations, which are swamps, marshes, and bogs. So they're very similar, but just make sure you know all the differences. And this paragraph here tells you the benefits and ecosystem services that wetlands have. They actually are very helpful in preventing runoff, reducing flooding. They recharge our aquifers, and they actually filter out pollutants. So some like to say that wetlands are the sinks of nature, that the plants there can actually take up chemicals or pollutants or metals out of the water so that they don't continue to travel to other systems. So it's really important that we save our wetlands. The problem is we've been destroying them, all right? We either fill them in or drain them for development. So this is a big issue in New Jersey. There was a new law passed where if you were to destroy wetlands, you had to create double the amount someplace else. The problem with this is there's only specific soils that can actually be used to recreate wetlands. So it takes a lot of research to figure out what location is best for a newly created wetland. We also impact them by all of our roads and our bridges because cars bring in more air and water pollution. So we actually pollute these lovely wetlands. And a lot of times invasive species also take over wetlands. And a perfect example is the Burmese python in the Everglades in Florida. The next thing that you should know about is they talk about here about excessive water withdrawals. And a lot of the time, the Colorado River, it often fails to reach the sea. All right, so our country, we actually pump so much water out of the Colorado River that sometimes it actually doesn't reach the Gulf of California. All right, and that's because the western part of the United States and Mexico is very arid, and sometimes we over pump that river. So just make sure we know that. So this also goes with our consumptive use and non-consumptive use. All right, consumptive is when we remove water from an aquifer surface water body and we don't return it. Non-consumptive is when we remove it, but then we put it back in. A perfect example of this is when we use water for cooling, like power plants or for electricity or hydroelectric dams. So we use it, but then we return it back in. Okay. talks a little bit about the RLC, which you did a case study on, and WebQuest, so make sure you know information again about this figure and caption about the RLC. All right, next one is groundwater depletion can cause sinkholes, so just make sure you know that that is an option. If we over pump our groundwater, we can actually change the surface of the earth and cause sinkholes to happen. Okay. All right, dikes and levees. Now, these are used to prevent flooding, to save farms, homes, and property. However, flooding is actually natural and important. So not all flooding is bad, all right? And that's because it brings nutrients to different locations every time it floods. A lot of the best farmland that we have is actually near rivers, and that's because of the flooding and the extra nutrients that flooding brings to the soil and the property. So even though it's good for some reasons to prevent flooding, other times it could be actually bad for the agricultural purposes. So just make sure that you know that flooding is a normal, natural process that has some benefits. Okay, an aqueduct. These are man-made rivers to carry water from one place to another. The Romans were one of the first. The ancient Romans were the first to create these aqueducts. They had them all through their cities. You can actually still see them. LA is really popular. Again, we're talking a lot about California. And this is how the South California gets water from Northern California or from the Colorado River. So this is one way that we have manipulated the distribution of water and bring it to places that have no fresh water. Okay, so this case study in here is actually pretty important. It talks all about bottled water, and everyone assumes that bottled water is safer because you're paying more for it. However, that's not always the case. Unlike our tap water, which has a lot of regulations, which we learned about in our lab, bottled water has very little regulations. They use huge amounts of energy to create all these bottled waters, between the production of the plastic bottles, the filling of the plastic bottles, the distribution, the travel to get them to the stores. So we're using actually a lot of fossil fuels, because remember, plastic is a byproduct of petroleum. And ironically, 60% of all bottled water contained endocrine disruptors. And we talked about this in the previous chapter, that your endocrine disruptors are things that are causing problems with fertility issues, with development of children. So just keep that in mind. That bottled water is not safer than tap water. Okay, we did a lot of work with this, but make sure you know all the positive and negative impacts of dams and reservoirs. And this diagram is actually really good. All the green are positive impacts of dams, and all the red are negative impacts of dams. So make sure that you know these here. Obviously, some of the positives is we get renewable energy. It can control flooding for seasonal surges. The carbon emissions are much lower than fossil fuels to create energy. You get reliable irrigation for farming. You have new recreational opportunities, so it actually creates more money. You get reliable drinking sources. You create all these new lakes. The problem is a lot of the times dams displace millions of people. You have sediment buildup. And if this dam ever breaks, you have a risk of such catastrophic failure. So we talked about this, where many of the time, like the Three Gorges Dam, when they do break or flood, millions of people's homes are lost, farms are lost, crops are lost, costs lots of money to create, but also a lot of money to clean up. It also messes up with the fishes and their population growth, because a lot of fish, like your salmon, they actually just swim upstream, and that's where they spawn or lay their eggs. So just keep that in mind.